Welcome. Thanks for attending today's session. I I have a video here, so I'm going to share my screen, optimize for video. There we go. All right, so we will be talking about advancing equity for LGBTQ plus people through language. And we're also a SAMHSA funded center. So I have our disclaimer here. So we're SAMHSA funded, but not all of the views necessarily reflect those views, opinions of SAMHSA or HHS. Our Center of Excellence focuses on addressing behavioral health disparities among LGBTQ populations. So you can check out our website. It's linked here and will be linked throughout the presentation. But we provide technical assistance, training, resources. We have free e-learnings, lots of webinars, panels, and all sorts of stuff on the website. And I like to say, if you are in need of some sort of resource and you don't see it on our website, you can reach out, let us know about it, and we will make sure to create it or find it for you. So we try to be a one-stop shop for folks that are reaching out for information on the community. So I will be talking about language today.
Can I pause you for just a quick second? We're actually seeing your the inside screen, the one that shows more versus the display one. If you get what I mean. There we go.
Okay. Great. Thank you. So I'll be talking about language today, some advanced language, things that have changed over time, updated terminology, but I want to kick off this presentation with a 6-minute animation that talks about the very basics of language with this population, which is defining sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, as well as the acronym LGBTQ. So this is the foundational information, and then I will jump into more advanced terminology.
Hello, and thanks for joining us today. Before we get started with today's live content, we want to talk about some basic terminology that is important to know when working with people who have diverse sexual orientations or diverse gender identities. There are 4 elements of identity that you will need to know: sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. First is sex assigned at birth, which is based on physical anatomy. This is often assigned before or immediately after birth by looking at the baby's anatomy. The most typical sex assigned at birth is either female or male, but there are other variations of sex worth noting. Variation in sex characteristics can be variations among hormones, chromosomes, or anatomy. The term intersex is used as an umbrella term for those born with varying sex characteristics. About 1 in every 100 people are born intersex. That's more common than most people think. So contrary to popular belief, there are in fact more sexes than just male or female. The next important term to know is gender identity. Gender identity is a person's internal sense of their own gender. All people have a gender identity, though not many people think about it. Gender identity is how you feel about your gender and your role in your culture's gendered practices. Gendered practices vary from culture to culture, so there isn't only one way to define being a girl, woman, boy, man, or any other gender. Gender identity forms very early in childhood, with some signs pointing to as early as 2 years old. When young children start to say, "I'm a boy" or "I am a girl," they are describing how they feel about their own gender. I would like to explain a few key terms related to gender identity. The word cisgender describes a person whose gender identity and sex assigned at birth match. The word transgender describes a person whose gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth. The term transgender is also an umbrella term for gender identities like gender fluid, non-binary, and agender. For more information on these terms, click the glossary link in the description. The next term you will want to know is gender expression. Gender expression describes how people express their gender externally. This could be through clothing, hobbies, mannerisms, or hairstyles. Gender expression and the expectations around expression have changed over time, and they may change day to day depending on how a person feels. Sometimes, one might dress more masculine one day and then decide to dress more feminine the next day. It's important to note that gender expression does not tell us how someone identifies their gender, and it is best not to assume who someone is based on their style of clothing. It's best to ask the person how they identify. Lastly, we will talk about sexual orientation. Sexual orientation describes feelings of attraction. Think back to when you had your last crush. What were the feelings you had? Maybe you felt excited when you saw the person you liked. Maybe you got nervous or shy around them. Or maybe your heart raced and you had attraction. Think back to when you had your last crush. What were the feelings you had? Maybe butterflies. These are all feelings of attraction. Attraction can mean different things to different people. But one thing to note is that these feelings are not a choice or something someone can control. We cannot tell our heart to slow down or our butterflies to go away. Sexual orientation can start to form around early childhood. Think back to when you had your very first crush. This is when your sexual orientation started to develop. Common terms you hear associated with sexual orientation are lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, queer, and straight. Lesbian describes a girl or woman who is primarily attracted to other girls or women. Gay describes boys or men who are primarily attracted to other boys or men. But this term is also used by anyone who is attracted to the same gender. Bisexual refers to people who are attracted to their own gender as well as other genders. Pansexual refers to someone who is attracted to people regardless of gender. Asexual is used to describe someone who may not feel sexual attraction to any gender. This does not mean that the person doesn't want to be in relationships. It just means that the element of sexual attraction is absent. You might have also heard the term queer. Queer is used as an umbrella term that can only be defined by the individual using it. The term continues to be hurtful to some people, especially older populations who experience this term as a slur. However, some people use this term as a source of pride and a symbol of determination. It's always best to use the term only if the person self-identifies as queer, and if the person gives you permission to refer to them in that way. Lastly, some people identify as straight, which means they are attracted to people of the opposite gender. Now that you have some basic terminology under your belt, you're ready to jump into more specific content to get to know this population's experiences better, and to gain skills on how to serve them best.
Okay, thanks for going through that and watching that quick video. I really like it because I can present that material, but it takes me 45 minutes to do it. So I like the animation because it's short and to the point, and the graphics are pretty amazing at getting some excellent points across. And so I'd like to also just like offer that as a resource. Our Center of Excellence created that animation to make everyone's lives easier as they're educating their colleagues or families or even young people or LGBTQ adults that you work with. So that video is on our resource page for the Center of Excellence. Please use it, share it with others. We've translated it into several languages, including Spanish, Portuguese, and French. And so go check out our resources page and share that with your colleagues. So I want to take a moment to talk about the acronym. The video uses LGBTQ+. Our Center of Excellence uses LGBTQ+. Some people might add different letters to that depending on what population they're serving or what kinds of things that they're trying to outreach to the community about. So a lot of HHS grantees, for example, will use LGBTQ2SIA plus. And so all of this is an effort to be inclusive. I know sometimes people that I'm talking to might roll their eyes at the constant changing of the acronym or how long it gets, but it's all in an effort to be as inclusive and precise as possible, which is really important when we're talking about language and equity centered practices. And so I want to talk about these other letters that you see represented here that weren't necessarily in the video, which is 2S, I, or A. And so I'll define those more fully, but I also want to take a moment to talk about the plus. So the plus in these acronyms is there to acknowledge that there are a lot of sexual orientations and gender identities and expressions that aren't explicitly represented in the acronym. So it's our attempt at giving nod to the great diversity within the community, wanting to have some brevity with the acronym, but still acknowledge that there are so many people that that go by different terms. And so you'll see that plus there to indicate that. But as I said, I want to go into some of these other terms just in a little bit more detail. So this was mentioned in the video briefly. Intersex populations are really important to think through when you're providing services because this population does have a unique set of experiences and circumstances that are different than some others in the LGBTQ community. So to define it again, it's an umbrella term that describes people with variations in sex characteristics. And this could include mixed hormones, chromosomes, elements of male and female reproductive systems, or genitalia that don't appear clearly male or clearly female at birth. So for example, a baby born with a vulva and testes. The reason I want to bring in this population specifically and say that they experience unique things is because their circumstances are definitely can be affected by things like blocking access to gender affirming care. For example, if like, let's say there are several states that may have bans on minors receiving hormone therapy, that could impact this population as well because they may need hormone therapy based off of the characteristics they're presenting with and how they're identifying their gender. And so we often don't think about intersex people as being impacted around anti-trans legislation or anti-trans policies or bans on gender affirming care, but it is important to call them out specifically to say this population is impacted by that as well. There's also a invisibility that this population navigates. As the video suggested, 1 in 100 babies are born with some sort of sex characteristic variations. Yet we don't talk about this population very often. And when this population is talked about, it's usually talked about as if it does not impact a lot of people. But the numbers are actually quite large in comparison to what people assume. And so when this population is trying to get services or try to talk to clinicians or outreach for support, there's a lack of information on them and just this general invisibility that impacts how they're able to receive care. Next, I'll just highlight asexuality. So asexual orientation describes people who experience little or no sexual desire or attraction. Asexual people may or may not experience romantic attraction or engage in romantic relationships. So this term may be used to solely describe a person's sexual orientation or serve as a modifier. So for example, someone who experiences, who doesn't experience sexual attraction, but experiences romantic attraction exclusively for women may identify as an asexual lesbian. The term ace is often used as a shorthand. So I like to bring this population in because I often see it included in the acronym, but people even when they're including asexuality in the acronym, don't usually talk about it or highlight the population specifically. So my golden rule is whatever is in the acronym, you need to be lifting it up. You need to be defining it. You need to be including it in presentations, in your policies. So if you use a variation of letters in your LGBTQ plus acronym, make sure that all of those letters have some space and visibility in the things that you're creating. Don't attach letters to the acronym that you're not going to give any attention to. So that's my rule as far as the acronym goes. This population also experiences a lot of stigma around people not believing that this sexuality exists. Folks telling people that are asexual, oh, you just haven't found the right person yet, or kind of forcing them or trying to encourage them to engage in different sexual relationships until they feel something differently. So this is very harmful for this population to experience. And again, it's also because of that invisibility, us not lifting up the experiences of asexual people very often. And so you can see just in this example how that language and how we use the language and how we lift up some of these terms and make sure that they're part of the conversation can either further stigma or contribute to that invisibility. The last term that I'll just describe specifically is Two-Spirit. So this is a term used by Native American communities. Not all Native American communities use it, so that's my caveat that I think is really important. But it is used to recognize individuals who possess qualities or fulfill roles of both men and women. These folks are often considered to be part man or part woman, holy man or holy woman. Sometimes revered as healers, very wise people within the tribe that are able to sort of navigate relationships. Sometimes they would be similar to like marriage counselors, where they could navigate relationships between men and women because they inhabit both spirits. And depending on the tribe, there may be different definitions. There also may be different terms used to describe LGBTQ people within tribal communities. Like I said, not all tribes use the term Two-Spirit. Some tribes have their own language to describe, or they may have their language may have survived, and so they have different terms and whatever their original dialect was. So just make sure that when you're using this term, you acknowledge that this doesn't go for all folks within tribal communities. And if you're working with specific tribal communities, to check in with them to see what is their preferred language around the population. So the question I always get around this is, how am I supposed to remember it all? And the good news is that you don't have to remember it all. The most important thing in my mind is that you acknowledge that there's a lot of diversity that people carry, and that these sexual orientations and genders are all valid. So you just have to be, the golden rule is kind of just be open to language shifting over time and people identifying in ways that you're unfamiliar with. And as long as you have that openness and that you acknowledge that however people are showing up to you and however they're identifying is valid, then you're on the right track. And then, I think if you are less familiar with some terms, just, you can look them up. There's so many resources now available to help us define these terms. There's a glossary that our Center of Excellence has that is on our resource page that you can go and check out. And there's glossaries from lots of other organizations. And then, if we really get stuck and we're not sure what a term means, we can ask people how they identify and what that means to them. So for example, there's a term genderqueer or queer in general. It has different definitions depending on who you talk to. So some people may say their queerness inhabits many genders, or let's go with that example. So many genders. But if you meet other people who identify as genderqueer, they may say actually they don't identify with any gender. And so it's important that when we hear someone identify as queer or genderqueer, that we ask, oh, what does that mean to you? Just so that we get a good sense of where they're coming from and how they're defining that. I'll also say that these terms vary from culture to culture. And so you may encounter terms you've never heard of that are very culturally specific. And in In those cases, you can look them up, or if it's necessary for you to understand the definition in that particular context, just asking the person like, oh, can you tell me what that means to you? So you have that understanding. And coming from, when you ask those questions, coming from a genuine place to make sure that you're not asking out of pure curiosity, but you are asking to help understand the person better and make sure that you can help support and provide services in the most affirming ways. So language is always evolving. So I want folks to sort of check in with themselves right now, because if you don't often have these conversations, you might be feeling some discomfort as I'm talking about these terms. And it's good to check in with yourself around where that discomfort might be coming from. The beautiful thing about language is that it is literally there to help us communicate what we are feeling to each other. So to help us understand each other more deeply, and to be able to communicate our feelings and emotions. And what's great about that is that language shouldn't be stagnant. It should always be evolving. As we evolve and understand ourselves and our communities more deeply and understand our experiences more deeply, we create new terms that help us describe those feelings and experiences that we're having. And that's a great and beautiful thing. And without that flexibility in language, we wouldn't be able to communicate and share our thoughts with others and share our emotions with others and intentions like we're able to do. So if you catch yourself sort of being uncomfortable with language evolving or new terms that you're less familiar with, just try to keep in mind that that's part of the process. That's what language is there for. It's what helps us, again, communicate with each other and live together and build together and just connect more deeply with one another. So with that being said, I'm going to jump into some updated language that has changed in the last few years, make sure everybody is all caught up on those changes. So you may hear in your workspaces or even use yourself terms like transgender male or transgender female. We suggest that you use instead transgender man, transgender boy, transgender woman, transgender girl. The reason this is because the terms male and female are often used to describe sex characteristics, sex assigned at birth. So we really want, and they're very medicalized. These terms like male and female, they're very medicalized and have their appropriate place in that sort of arena. But when we're talking most often about trans people, we're talking about gender identity. So it's better to say the gender identities that be precise in our language, right, around what genders we're talking about, which are man, woman, boy, girl, or it could be non-binary or another gender. But most often what we're talking about is trans man, trans woman. So instead of saying male and female, just replacing your language in those areas. I also still hear terms homosexual and heterosexual. It's still pretty common. Homosexual, I'll just say, is considered derogatory within the community because it was used so often as a negative thing. And usually when people are using it, there is some sort of stigma or some sort of like negative connotation with it. So we prefer the actual sexual orientations that people are identifying with. So instead of saying homosexual, you would say LGBTQ plus if you're talking about the whole community, or you would say whatever sexual orientation you're specifically talking about, like lesbian, gay, bisexual, straight, pansexual, queer. And because we apply that rule to the term homosexual, we apply it to heterosexual as well. So instead of saying heterosexual people versus LGBTQ plus people, we would just say sexual orientation is the umbrella term for it, and then people's identities, including the sexual orientation of straight. Another term we should talk about is bisexuality. So bisexual is defined as attraction to more than one gender. So this is probably new for some folks. I think in the past, it was really described as being defined as someone who's bisexual is attracted to both men and women. But since we have a better understanding of gender identity now, and we understand that there are a lot of people who also identify as non-binary, for example, or different terms for their gender identity, we no longer say both men and women. We say bisexual is a sexual orientation where someone is attracted to more than one gender. So it's just a more inclusive way to describe what the bi plus community, the bisexual community, has said is important to them. Another term you may not have heard of is monosexuality. So monosexuality is romantic or sexual attraction to members of one sex or gender only. So if we think about the definition I just gave for bisexuality, it's that someone is attracted to more than one gender. Monosexuality is attracted to one gender only. So this would be people who identify as straight, lesbian, gay, and that is an important term because it helps us define monosexism. So monosexism refers to the belief that monosexuality is superior. Monosexuality refers to the sexual orientation or romantic attraction to only one gender. So when we think about the bi plus community, those who are bisexual or even pansexual, they often are experiencing discrimination because they are attracted to more than one gender. And so they get pressure from, let's say, lesbian and gay folks to be more lesbian or gay, and they get pressure from straight folks to be more straight, or they're asked to pick a side, to not be greedy. Oh, you don't, if someone comes out as bisexual, they might hear someone say, oh, well, you're not actually bisexual. You're just like going through a phase, or you just haven't decided yet what gender you're most attracted to. And so all of these comments are rooted in monosexism, which is this idea that being attracted to one gender is superior than being attracted to more than one gender. So super important concept for us to wrap our heads around. And if you're working in behavioral health spaces, which I think most of you are, it's important to know that this community, bi plus folks, pansexual folks, they experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, suicidality when compared to straight, lesbian, or gay individuals. And a lot of that is rooted in this heightened experience, this sort of increased rate of discrimination and harassment from both the straight community and the lesbian and gay community. Bisexual people will often say they feel like there is no space for them to be themselves, that they're getting pressure from both communities to conform to monosexuality. And so these terms, again, they're relatively new, but they help us define and describe the experiences that this community has been experiencing. We also hear these are outdated terms: lifestyle, choice, or preference. So when we say, oh, this is this person's choice, or their, the gay lifestyle, or their sexual preference, we want to avoid all of those terms. They denote that, number one, any of these feelings are a choice, and people are choosing to be a certain sexual orientation or gender identity, which is very dismissive of the actual experience of LGBTQ plus people, which is we are what we are. And that goes for all people, including straight people. They are what they are, right? They're attracted to who they're attracted to. And so instead of those terms, we just say what we mean. We're precise in our language. We say sexual orientation or gender identity. So that's that person's sexual orientation. Their gender identity is XYZ. Just a couple of more to go through. Instead of saying preferred pronouns or preferred name, just say pronoun. So instead of saying this is their preferred pronouns, you just say this is their pronouns, or this is their correct pronouns. And that's because, again, we want to get away from this idea that identities are a preference or a choice. You definitely want to use the term transgender as a verb instead of using transgender as a verb, excuse me, you want to use it as an adjective. So it's there to describe someone's experience around gender. So instead of saying, someone is transgendered, transgendering, you would just say this person is a trans man or trans woman, transgender man, transgender woman. So it's just there to as a describer. Another outdated language, a person used to be a man or a woman, a person was born a boy or a girl. So instead of saying used to be, like just get away from that language entirely, because a person's gender identity is what it is, and that person may have identified it as, you know, a trans man may have identified as a man their entire lives, and it's just that you know, maybe you're just knowing them as that then, but it definitely is dismissive of the trans experience, and trans people, the community has said that it's very hurtful, this language, and so we want to move away from that. And if you're in the medical field and you need to describe, this is the only time you would need to describe anyone's sex assigned at birth, is probably if you're their physician and you need to describe something that's going on with them biologically, then you would say sex assigned at birth. Or you would say biological characteristics, and saying, instead of saying used to be or was born a boy or a girl. So intersectionality is a really important piece of this conversation too. And so thinking about race, age, sex, gender, appearance, class, ability, all of these categories of how we show up in the world and in spaces impact the way that we experience both privilege and systems of oppression. And so because of these really unique experiences that we have because of our identities, we tend to create terms that are very like culturally specific or in-group terms into our cultures. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how that occurs. So queer is a term used by some, but is, you know, some within the LGBTQ community, generally younger populations, but is still considered derogatory for older adults within the LGBTQ plus community, primarily because queer was used as a very harmful slur for decades for this community. And so there's still a lot of hurt around it. There's a historical trauma around the term. And so queer is one of those terms that, you know, is often used by some age groups, not so much others. What's also really important about the term queer is that it's an in-group term for the most part. So it's, you know, allies, LGBTQ plus allies might be able to use it in certain circumstances. People within the community can use it. But if I don't know someone and if I was passing someone on the street and they called me queer, then the context has changed. And now that feels very derogatory to me. So it's just an example of how language can feel different when it's used by different people or within your community. Same gender loving is also an important term to call out. It speaks to the intersectionality of people who are African American or Black, and then and also identify as lesbian or gay. So this community, instead of saying lesbian or gay, might use same gender loving as a way to describe their sexual orientation beyond sexuality or beyond like sexual behavior. And so it's actually like a really powerful term. And I would, if you're unfamiliar with it, you know, going and doing a little bit of research, looking it up and looking up the history might be good. But it's just an example of how a specific ethnic group uses language differently. And then I already talked about two-spirit being a term to describe some, you know, people who embody two or more genders, but only used with some tribes and not all of them. So just a few examples to talk about how race and other, like race and age in particular with those examples, you know, can impact the way that we're using language. A little note on pronouns. If you're unfamiliar with pronouns, definitely take a closer look at this resource, or you can also just like probably Google gender pronoun resources, and there's so many online now that will come up. But we're most familiar with she and he, right? As pronouns. She is speaking, I listen to her, the backpack is hers. Same thing with he, we're very familiar with those. A lot of folks do go by they and them. These are gender neutral pronouns that provide more space for folks who are non-binary or might have a gender identity of multiple gender identities, or maybe gender fluid. And so they and them provides a more accurate way to describe someone and make sure that there's space for folks with those genders. And so you would just say, they are speaking, I listen to them, the backpack is theirs. And when I'm presenting this information, usually people will say, well, that's really hard for me. We don't usually use this pronoun as a neutral term. But I think we do actually use this pronoun quite frequently as a neutral term. So for example, if I found a backpack in a park, I would say, I hope that, I don't know whose backpack this is. I hope they come and pick it up from lost and found, right? And so we do use these terms, even though we may not think we do very often when we don't know the gender of someone or some object. And so, if it's unfamiliar to you, if it feels a little uncomfortable, make sure that you, practice with it, learn about it, get some more information on it. Then there's also another set of pronouns that's quite common, which is yourself, or ears, yourself. There's different pronunciations of this particular pronoun. So if you're working with someone that goes by this pronoun, it's always nice to check in and say, like, how do you pronounce this, so that you can make sure that you're pronouncing it correctly. There's also a bunch of other neo pronouns that aren't listed here. And these are pronouns that, again, as language is evolving and people are understanding themselves more and understanding what fits them best, pronouns emerge, and people try them on and see if they fit and see if they feel good. And so just, if you're unfamiliar with it, Google it, do a little bit of information gathering on different pronouns that exist. The most important thing with all of this is that equitable language makes space for people. It acknowledges people for who they are. It validates their experiences, and that is super important. That's more important than our own comfort with what words we should or should not be using. So just know that acknowledging someone can literally save their lives. And we have research on this. So we know from the Trevor Project reports that come out annually, having conversations about sexual orientation and gender identity reduces suicide attempts among young people. In their 2019 report, the Trevor Project found that LGBTQ plus youth who report having at least one accepting adult in their lives were 40% less likely to report a suicide attempt. So when we think about comfort, our own comfort with language versus reducing suicidality, there's no contest in what's most important, right? Even if you're unfamiliar about this language, or you feel like it's very uncomfortable to use some of this language, just consider like what an impact you could have on someone's life by just practicing, getting familiar with it, and validating their experiences as they state them. We also know that when LGBTQ plus young people are in environments where they are always affirmed, over 90% of them believe they can grow up to be a happy adult. And on the flip side of that, when they are in environments where they are not at all affirmed, only 35% of them think that they can grow up to be happy, healthy adults. So this is a really powerful piece of data in my mind. I think we're talking about hope here. And hope is the foundation of resilience, right? And so when we think about people overcoming obstacles, overcoming discrimination, overcoming bullying and hardships, we think about resilience. And in order for that resilience to be there and hope, people have to believe that they can grow up and be happy. And that is greatly improved when they are affirmed by the people around them. We also know that transgender youth who were able to change their name and gender marker on legal documents, such as driver's license and birth certificates, report lower rates of attempting suicide. So this is just another example of how the power of even written language and legal validation can be really important to saving lives. And then as far as your workplace is concerned, because we're not just talking about people that you're serving, right? We're also talking about your coworkers. You have coworkers that identify within this population. And if you don't know about it, I'm almost certain that you do, or that your coworkers have loved ones that identify within this population. And we know that LGBTQ plus supportive workplaces lead to LGBTQ plus adults being happier in their workplaces, but also experiencing improved health and better relationships with coworkers. So just keep in mind that even if you're not around your clients or the people that you're serving, that what you say and the language you use also has an impact on your coworkers and you know, the teams that you form in your workspace. So let me speed through a few resources that I think are important for you to know about. So one was the video on language. I have it linked in here, so you'll get the PDF of these slides after the session. And so you'll be able to click on these links directly. But if you go to this link, you'll be taken to our English video on sexual orientation, gender identity. If you want any of the other languages, you'll just go to our resource page and you'll have those there. We also have another animation that talks about specifically providing equitable and affirming care to LGBTQ plus older adults. And so that one is really cool because it talks about the historical trauma of just like decades of LGBTQ plus history, including a period where being LGBTQ plus was criminalized, and how that impacts today's LGBTQ plus older adults. So if you're unfamiliar with that population, or if you serve that population currently and can use this as a resource, go back and check out that video. We also have a glossary that's pretty comprehensive, and it's in English, Spanish, and Portuguese at the moment. And then everything I presented on the updated language, we have a whole resource guide on that you can download. We also have online training available, which can be really helpful if you need online training or if your teams need some sort of online training. You can go to our website and participate in self-paced e-learning modules. We have introductory courses, we have advanced courses, and we also have courses that are for people who are not necessarily clinical providers, but work in that space. So people who may be welcoming folks into services, doing intake, customer service representatives, folks who are taking phone calls. So if you have folks on your team that need some training that's not clinically specific, but opens up the space for how do you just like address and create, you know, address LGBTQ plus people, but create an affirming environment, then this would be a really great resource for them. And that actually concludes my slides here. So I'm going to stop sharing and I think just open it up to see if any questions came in through the chat.
Yeah, there is a question from Michael Montoya. It's towards the very end, I believe. There's a couple. Salma Torres made a statement.
Yeah, so the question is, could you address the use of A in the acronym to represent allies? Personally, I think that it would apply in a limited way. Yeah, so my thought on acronyms are to just be really intentional about them, right? I see a lot of organizations use acronyms, like for example, they'll use LGBTQ IA2S plus, but then you look on their websites and they have nothing specific to intersex populations, folks who are asexual, or to spirit, or projects that are dedicated to improving LGBTQ people's lives, but then they have no services for trans people. It's only sexual orientation that they're working with. So I think when you're using an acronym, like the most important thing is that you are precise and intentional with it, right? And so some organizations, like some causes, like certainly the A could stand for allies. Like say, for example, you're creating a, let's say an LGBTQ plus support space and you want allies to feel welcome, you might include the A and say, this is for allies. I think most often though, when we're talking about the LGBTQ plus population, we're referring to it as this group because there are some shared experiences that the group has together. For example, the coming out process, dealing with bullying, dealing with healthcare invisibility, dealing with family rejection. And those are experiences that are very specific to folks that have diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, in which the A would not apply to. I mean, if we're talking about straight and cisgender allies, they wouldn't apply. I could go sort of like down a wormhole with this because I am a queer woman. I'm cisgender, but I am a trans ally, right? So I could be in the acronym in a couple different ways. But I think the most important thing is that we're thoughtful about how we're using it. We're not using it in tokenizing ways. We're not just throwing acronyms in there to be performative in our inclusivity, right? So I think that's what's really important there, but it's a good question. Yeah, so Jules asks a really important question. How do you get organizations to actually engage in these trainings and adopt the language practices? I think that it can be difficult if the organization is not in like what we would call a readiness space to engage in these conversations. The organization would probably benefit from some foundational policies. Like, one, do you even have a non-discrimination policy that specifically mentions non-discrimination for LGBTQ plus people? And if so, that's great. So then my second question is, what's your policy around when the organization asks staff to take a training or mandates training, but then the staff do not participate in it? What's the protocol for how to work with those staff who refuse to engage in ongoing learning? And if there's no protocol in place, then that makes this conversation a little bit more difficult. But if I was working with an organization that was really not in a place to just jump into training, I would start with conversations. Conversations to understand what are people's barriers, what are their fears, what are their concerns regarding the population, and try to develop some shared understanding around values, right? What's the mission of the organization? How can we support LGBTQ plus people with the values and missions of, let's say, a healthcare organization or mental health care organization? So sometimes starting at the place of conversation and building up some understanding about why a training is coming can be helpful. But it just depends on sort of where the organization is and what kinds of policies and what your leadership looks like, all of that. Another question. Oh, I see. So can you speak more about how same gender loving is used and how or who uses this as their sexual orientation? So I would say that I'm not the best person to define it because I don't use it and because I don't identify as African American or in the Black community. And that's the community that has used that word and defined that term and has lifted it up. And so there are very specific reasons they use it that I think they're best at defining, but I'll do my best based off of conversations with that community. So basically, my understanding is that before we were using the acronym LGBTQ, homosexuality was the word that was used to describe anyone who had a diverse sexual orientation. And folks within the Black community were like, wait, this is more than just sex. We want to get away from the term sex. This isn't just about sexual behavior. It's my relationship with this person. It's my love with this person. It's my lifetime spent with this person. And so they started using same gender loving to describe the relationships that they were in. And so there is, that's my understanding of the history. But again, it's not a term that I use and I'm not part of the community. So best practices are always to sort of go back to the original source. But hopefully that's helpful in providing some of that context. And then I see someone has a question in here. I work in an organization that have the words girl and boy in the name. Many are historical organizations and are inclusive of all gender identities. What would your recommendation be on how to best to address this to ensure inclusive language and support within the services offered? So I think that we've worked with a lot of organizations that have very like specific missions or specific names in this way, like we were just working with the university, that their mission was to create innovative and safe spaces for girls and women to get their education. And they have a lot of people who were identifying as trans men or non-binary in their courses, and they were really struggling about how to talk about the population and be inclusive and stay true to their like mission. And so I think that it's a little bit of a balance always. It depends on your organization. What is the mission and vision? Are having the genders in your title necessary for the work that you do? And, you know, if you're holding on to it for historical reasons, just acknowledging that if someone had an aversion to the terms boys and girls or didn't see themselves represented there, there's the very true reality that they just might not come and get support from your organization, or they may just not engage in services. And so that's something that as leadership in an organization, you sort of have to consider and accept, especially if you're holding onto the name for historical reasons, just accepting that there's a group of people that may not access your services because of the name. With all that being said, you can still have policies and practices and language in the way that you operate and your day-to-day services that do make it more inclusive for folks. So making sure that, you know, flyers that you have, even if you have your name at the top, that somewhere there's some inclusion of non-binary folks or some other gender identity that you're trying to outreach to. So you can certainly, you know, create a balance in the other materials you have. And I would say your website and your social media are really great places to do that, especially if you're trying to do outreach. Most of the time, people will go online to see what an organization's about before engaging in services, right? And so if I go to your website and I see very clearly on the front page that you have an outreach message to LGBTQ people, I would be much more comfortable receiving services there. All right, I'm just scrolling through, seeing if could you drop a link to the learning modules? I can absolutely do that. Pulling those up now. These e-learnings are great. They offer free continuing education credits for anyone that needs them, certificates of attendance for those that find that helpful. And so if you're an organization that wants to bring free training to your staff and you need something that's flexible and self-paced, then that is a great option, because you can have your team members print off certificates of attendance and monitor it that way. So Steve, I think I got all of the questions here, unless you're seeing any that I missed.
There's just one that just came in from Kelly. Is there a term to use instead of female identifying that messages all women, not just cisgender women?
Yeah, I think women, women is the inclusive term for people who identify as women, regardless whether their status is trans or cisgender. So I would just say women. And then if I needed to be specific for some reason, which I really don't know it would really be more like healthcare related is when you would need to be specific about trans or cis, but I would just say women.